Imagine how boring the world would be if understanding something was as easy as looking at it. If that were the case, there would be no mysteries. And without mysteries, we'd have no questions to answer. We love riddles and enigmas on this channel, and we have plenty of them to show you today. This is a collection of discoveries that came with more questions than answers. The older the ruins of an old town or settlement become, the harder they are to trace back to their origin. Since summer 2017, archaeologists have been puzzling over a set of mysterious rings found close to the tip of the Seltjarnarnes Peninsula, close to Reykjavik in Iceland. They initially thought the rings were the remains of an old Viking settlement, but that theory didn't last for long. Experts still think the rings are a relic of the Viking era, but rather than being made by native Vikings, it may be more likely that they're all that's left of a town that was built by Irish settlers. The rings, which can only be seen from the air, were first noticed and recorded during the 1980s, but no archaeological attempt to study and understand them began until more than 30 years later. It's been possible to date the settlement to the year 874, thanks to the presence of a layer of tephra left behind by a volcanic eruption in 871. There has long been speculation that there were Irish settlements in the southwest of Iceland because of the Celtic place names in areas close to Faxaflói Bay. Between those place names and the distinctly Irish style of these old settlement boundary walls, maybe the proponents of that theory finally have some validation. There's been a frenzy of archaeological activity in Egypt recently. The country is attempting to rebuild its tourist industry, and discoveries from the time of ancient Egypt help with that effort immeasurably. Here's a strange new finding from July 2020. A research team studying the history of human occupation in the Abydos area has found a secret network of caves and chambers carved directly into the rocky cliffs of the Sacred Valley, part of the royal cemetery of al-Kab. The entrance to the tunnels is high up among the cliffs and is difficult to access even now. Presumably, it would have been even harder for people living in ancient times. Most of the narrow openings lead to clusters of chambers, all of which probably started as natural tunnels in the bedrock, carved by flowing water, but then enhanced by human hands. They feature benches, troughs in the floor, holes cut into the walls, and in some cases, a few carvings and inscriptions. A lack of human remains in any of the tunnels suggests they're unlikely to have been used as tombs, and yet there are names carved into the walls of some of them. One of them, dedicated to a man named Kusu-Nhor and his mother Amenirdes, dates the chambers to the Ptolemaic period of 2,300 years ago. The function of the rooms remains unknown. Human skulls have been painted by many different civilizations and cultures for many different reasons over the centuries. Sometimes they're painted for ceremonial reasons or as a mark of respect. On other occasions, they're painted purely for decorative reasons. We're still not quite sure why this skull from Vienna, Austria was painted, but we do know it was done a very long time ago. The skull was found apparently discarded in a meadow and was initially assumed to be a fake, but it was later discovered to be real and belonged to a male who was elderly when he passed away. The words "Hanged 1612" are painted on the skull, but they're misleading. The skull is undoubtedly old, but not quite 17th century old. It's more likely to have belonged to someone born around 100 years later. The name of a woman, Amélie Lagrange, is also painted on the skull. The significance of the name is unknown and could be misleading. Archaeologist Karen Fisher-Osserer believes the skull and jawbone come from different people, which makes this artifact even stranger. According to Norse mythology, even the gods feared vulvas. A vulva was a woman with greater powers than any shaman or seer, effectively a living god. Were vulvas purely fictional beings, though? Or did the ancient Scandinavians believe such people lived among them? Most historians have always assumed that vulvas were purely mythic, because no flesh and blood woman would be ascribed with such powers in ancient times. But this mysterious grave discovery has some people questioning that idea. More than 30 Viking Age graves were found near Frikot Viking Fortress in Hobro, Denmark, but one of them isn't like all the others. It was found to contain a woman dressed in a regal blue robe adorned with golden thread. Her body had been placed in a horse-drawn carriage, which is a practice usually reserved for royalty. Her toe rings are even more unusual, made from silver and designed in a style never seen before in Scandinavia. The bronze bowls placed next to the carriage are from Central Asia. While it would be easy to say she was a queen or princess rather than a vulva, the presence of a metal wand seems to imply otherwise. The final detail is a small purse containing henbane seeds. We know that Viking Age shamans threw these seeds into fires to create smoke with hallucinogenic properties. If she has great riches, a wand, and the tools of a shaman, she must surely have been a vulva. While the pyramids in Egypt are the most famous in the world, the Egyptians were a long way from being the only pyramid builders in the ancient world. Almost every great civilization was at it, and we have no idea why. In some cases, we don't really know who built them or when. As an example, here are the pyramids of Güímar in Spain. They're made from lava stone and might have been built as recently as the 19th century, although it would be odd for them to be so relatively new and yet for there to be no record of their construction. Some people believe they're far older and may have been an important connection between the ancient empires of the Egyptians and the Mayans. As a further complication, the 6 pyramids have been noticed to be similar in size to those built by the Aztecs in Mexico. A volcanic cave under one of the pyramids has been dated to between the 6th and 10th centuries, which might be a more likely window for their construction. Even now, the official history of the area says these pyramids were built by bored farmhands and serve no purpose. But does that really seem likely to you? The achievements of the ancient Chinese when it comes to hydraulic engineering and building waterways are already well known, but the more we study them, the more astonishing those accomplishments become. The latest amazing ancient water engineering accomplishment that's come to light is this one at Bianjianshan, built by the Liangzhu culture more than 5,000 years ago. It's a series of high and low dams, and according to archaeologists, it would have required a workforce of more than 3,000 people around a decade to complete. Prior to this 2017 discovery, it had been thought that the world's oldest hydraulic engineering system was built in Mesopotamia 4,900 years ago. But this is at least 2 centuries older. Understanding how to shape the movement of water was crucial to the survival of the Liangzhu culture. They lived on the banks of the Yangtze River Delta and were vulnerable to floods. So they learned to build houses on stilts before working out how to engineer the flow of the water itself. They're also credited with being the first culture in the world to develop advanced irrigation techniques and cultivate paddy rice fields. Whenever an archaeologist finds an ancient artifact, the first thing they'll look for is an inscription or carving of some kind to help them understand it. 9 times out of 10, the inscription will answer most of the questions they have, but not in the case of the so-called Magna Carta sword, also known as the River Witham sword on account of where it was found in England in 1825. The ancient medieval weapon does have an inscription, but it's proven to be impossible to translate. The British Library even solicited the help of the general public in 2015 in the hope that someone would be able to crack the code. But despite several suggestions, no definitive translation could be identified. The inscription was clearly important to the sword's owner, as they went to the trouble of having it inlaid in gold wire, but it's incomprehensible. It appears to be a string of nonsensical letters, with a cross at each end, and might be a religious invocation or a personal mantra. Swords of this style, inlaid with personalized inscriptions, were popular in Europe during the 12th century. That provides us with a likely period for the blade's manufacture, but doesn't get us any closer to solving this very ancient riddle. Right at the start of this video, we looked at the site of a possible Irish settlement in the heart of ancient Viking territory. Now, here's what might be an ancient Celtic cult site in Langenenschlingen, Germany. The site, surrounded by the remains of a stone wall that was once 16 feet high, was used or occupied around 2,600 years ago. Building a wall that high back then was no easy task, so we can only assume that whoever was inside the walls wanted to be very sure that outsiders couldn't gain access. That raises the possibility that whatever went on in there was secretive. The presence of a sacrificial well with human remains at the bottom of it all but confirms that this was a cult center. Archaeological evidence recovered from the site thus far suggests that it remained in use for around 400 years before eventually being abandoned. The Celtic hill fort of Hunaburg is only 5 miles away from here and is around the same age, suggesting a possible connection between the two places. Sadly, there's so little evidence here that we'll probably never know for sure. The Ankh is famously Egyptian and is one of the most important symbols of the ancient Egyptian world. How then could there be an ancient Egyptian Ankh standing on former Aztec territory in Mexico? That's a controversial question, but here it is. It's alternatively known as Monument Number 4, Cross Altar, or Zompantli, and it stands in Calitzlahuaca in modern-day Toluca. According to Egyptologists, the Ankh is a symbol of eternal life, but its origin is unknown. That meaning appears to have been flipped on its head in Mexico. Monument Number 4 is covered in carved stone skulls, and is thought to have once displayed the very real heads of sacrificial victims. This appears to be yet another example of parallels between the ancient Aztecs and the ancient Egyptians. Both cultures built pyramids, both cultures closely monitored the movements of the sun, both believed in an afterlife, and both went to elaborate lengths to prepare their deceased loved ones for passage into that afterlife. How could they have so much in common when they lived on opposite sides of an enormous ocean with no way of traveling across it? Archaeologists have a hard enough job getting to the bottom of the secrets left behind by ancient civilizations, even when those civilizations leave whole ruined settlements full of clues behind. Their job is even harder when those civilizations appear to go to great lengths to leave behind no clues at all. That's a common problem for anybody who's ever tried to study the Cuciteni Tripilian culture of ancient Romania. They first appeared roughly 7,500 years ago and spread across Central Europe rapidly, claiming territory in Ukraine and Moldova. A little under 3,000 years later, they were gone, and nobody knows why. They've almost erased themselves from the historical narrative. Every 60 to 80 years, the Cuciteni Tripilians deliberately burned their settlements to the ground before moving on. In the process, they destroyed archaeological evidence, monuments, possessions, and almost anything else that would have allowed modern archaeologists to understand them better. They're the only ancient culture in the world that are known to have done this deliberately. The burning of the old settlements after such a comparatively short window of time must have had an important and specific meaning, but it's lost on us. Most people don't know this, but the word juggernaut comes from Jagannath Temple in Puri, India. That's far from the only interesting thing about this unique 11th century temple. Jagannath Temple is one of India's 4 Chardham temples, each one positioned specifically and deliberately at a cardinal point on the compass. It's also by far and away the most architecturally accomplished and significant of them. The temple covers more than 400,000 square feet and contains more than 100 individual smaller temples and shrines. The mysteries here are plain to see, yet nobody discusses them. The flag at the top of the temple's spire always ripples in the opposite direction of the wind, which ought to be impossible. Birds never fly directly over the top of the tower. The building itself never casts a shadow. The Sudarshan Chakra, a sculpture at the top of the tower, always faces the observer, no matter where that observer might stand. All of these things sound so impossible that they ought to be ridiculous. and yet every phenomenon has been observed and recorded. The absence of the shadow can be put down to sophisticated building design, and the sculpture might be an optical illusion. But how does the flag defy physics? And what do birds have against it? Is the Narmer palette the world's oldest historical document? Well, perhaps we shouldn't expect a clear answer on that from historians. They can't even agree on what it ought to be called. For every person who calls it the Narmer palette, there's another who calls it the Great Hierakonpolis palette. The curious artifact was found at Egypt's Temple of Horus in 1897 and is a little over 5,100 years old. Whether or not it's the oldest document in the world, the hieroglyphs carved into its surface are the oldest in Egypt. Proponents of the theory about it being the world's oldest document point to the differences between the two depictions of King Narmer on either side of the artifact. He wears the red crown associated with Lower Egypt on one side, and the white crown associated with Upper Egypt on the other. This is the oldest drawing of an ancient Egyptian ruler, but more importantly, it could be interpreted as a record of Narmer's incredible achievement of unifying the ancient kingdom of Egypt. Those who dispute this say that it's actually a reference to a military victory by Narmer's forces over the ancient Libyans. Although, to be honest, we don't see how that would change its status as the world's oldest document.
Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, and you will be the first to know when a new video comes out. Thank you for watching, and see you soon.